All right, as the high-stakes G20 summit is all set to kick off in the Indian capital, all eyes are now on a possible joint declaration which has to be out, but where will it lead? So far, reports say the G20 negotiators do not have any officials were unable to resolve disagreements over the wording of the summit declaration, specifically concerning the Russia-Ukraine war.
Right. Now, any possibility of a breakthrough lies totally on the two-day leaders' summit, a 38-page draft seen by news agency Reuters. It's been reportedly circulated among members, and the document leaves a paragraph on geopolitical situation blank. The blank space potentially overshadows the agreements on the 75 other paragraphs, which include climate change, cryptocurrencies, reforms in multilateral development banks. G20 Sherpas were struggling for days to agree on the language. Differences persist.
However, India hopes to get Russia on board. But in the absence of an agreement, India will have to issue a chair statement. If such a situation arises, it would mean that G20 will not have a declaration for the first time in 20 years of the summit.
Moreover, Russia is not alone in raising objections. China also has followed suit in opposing the language around the war in Ukraine, its implications and the need for a resolution. The entire fate of the joint communique rests on a debate over 255 words. Last year, even as Russia-Ukraine war commenced and intensified, the G20 agreed on a joint declaration in Bali.
Now, India and Indonesia brokered a last-minute bargain to which both Moscow and Beijing agreed. This year, as India assumed the presidency, the two countries backtracked from their positions. The Chinese President Xi Jinping is skipping the meeting. He has sent Premier Li Qiang instead. Russia's Vladimir Putin is also absent from the summit. So the summit is likely to be dominated by essentially the Western nations. Well, the West and essentially the narrative that they carry. And all eyes are now on India's role as the arbitrator here.
这是归功于中华民族高度评价您在往年所取得的成绩。
За последние годы Китай сделал колоссальный рывок вперед в своем развитии.
最近这些年来，中国在这个发展中。
Now, we have with us Voice of America White House correspondent Jessica Stone. Our principal diplomatic correspondent Siddhant Sibal will be joining us live as well. And also on the show today, we'll have with us Gordon G. Chang, author of The Coming Collapse of China and the Great US-China Tech War, distinguished senior fellow Gatestone Institute. Thank you all for joining us on the show.
To be here.
Thank you.
Now, Jessica, let's start with you. The bilateral between President Joe Biden and Prime Minister Modi concluded the previous evening. US and India ties only seem to be growing warmer from here. Trade between the nations, it's nearly doubled since 2014. Talk to us about how the G20 summit will enhance the India-US strategic partnership going forward.
Well, White House officials say these two leaders have really grown in warmth in their personal relationship and that going forward, they really have something in common in terms of a technocratic approach to government. They get in the weeds together. They love to talk about technology and defense at a very granular level. And so the White House officials that were briefing reporters last night on what went on during the bilateral meeting just said, you know, there's a real synergy between these two leaders. And they also see the G20 very similarly. Now, the U.S. is looking to keep the G20 relevant as a means of keeping the global economies, having a forum to discuss economic issues, especially post-pandemic. And even before that, of course, it began after the 2008 financial crisis. And India sees it as a way to reach the global south, give the global south a greater voice. So that's really how you see a shared sense of purpose between these two leaders going forward in terms of making the G20 relevant and giving a greater voice inside the G20 for global south issues.
Thanks, Jessica. Gordon, I'd like to come to you next. We wanted to ask you, just taking forward from what Jessica just mentioned regarding the India-US strategic ties, how do you feel the defense ties are going to develop from here between the two nations? They've obviously had a major meeting in June and now, of course, this bilateral here in New Delhi. How do you see it developing from here going forward?
Well, India-US ties probably will have very little effect about what India feels or the United States feels. It's probably going to be what China and Russia do. because China is certainly been pushing India with, for instance, the fighting in Ladakh in June 2020, the killing of 21 Indian troopers. And of course, China has been pressing the United States, its friends and allies in East Asia. Right now, for instance, there are very belligerent Chinese actions at Second Thomas Shoal in the Philippines. So it's really going to be China, I think, that really shapes the India-U.S. relationship. And we're going to be reacting. India is going to be reacting, and China will be driving events because there's some very, very disturbing events in Beijing right now. It looks like the regime could be tearing itself apart. That's going to have consequences felt in New Delhi and Washington.
All right, thank you so much. Now, Siddhant, coming to you now, how do you feel now Chinese President Xi Jinping and Russian President Putin's absence will affect the flow at the G20 Summit? There's been a lot of speculation, a lot of talk about it as well. Do you feel the Western nations stand to benefit from their absence in any way?
Well, it's always not necessary that all the leaders are present at G20 Summit. In fact, since 2010, when it comes to the summit's proceeding, there's always one or two leaders who are absent. The maximum number of time a summit saw the absence of leaders was the Italy summit, which happened in 2021. Last year, we saw the Russian president not present at the Bali summit. The Mexican president never comes. He deputes a minister. It has been happening since a few years. So essentially, that doesn't impact the proceedings. And there is always a representation. In fact, during this year's summit, there is a representation from Mexico, from Russia, and from China, 3 member countries of the G20 who are absent at the leadership level. Now, when it comes to any benefit the Western countries will get, well, of course, someone's absence gives another space to have conversation. And remember, the summit here in Delhi has a maximum number of the presence of countries of the global south, and these Western countries will be keen to increase their engagement with the countries of the global south, especially the member countries when it comes to the African Union and others, given the fact that African Union is all set to become the member of the G20 grouping, a permanent invitee, something that New Delhi has proposed. So largely this summit will see a direction towards focus on the issues of the global south. That is the priority of the Indian presidency, and we will see a lot of outcomes even if there is no clarity on the joint statement so far.
Jessica, I'd like to come to you next. This is something we were discussing earlier in the newsroom as well. How do you feel the G20 summit can push for multilateralism in terms of global trade? And that's one term that we've been hearing repeatedly, and we knew that there's going to be a lot which will be discussed around it. Talk to us about it.
Well, certainly that's the agenda, right, for the G20, is to keep global trade going, to keep global economies talking. I think the interesting thing is that we've seen this movement that India has led this year towards giving lower economies, low-income economies, a greater voice in all of this. And that is what's driving both the U.S. and India to work on these issues of multilateral development reform. I mean, there has been an appetite in the United States to do that, especially among progressives. Joe Biden certainly has a tough job selling that message to the more populist voters inside the United States. So that's an element that he has to take it home. But in terms of working on these reforms, I mean, this is a direct counter answer to what Gordon Chang is talking about in terms of the impact that China has had on the global economy, the debt trap loans that have happened through the Belt and Road Initiative, and other types of financial relationships that China has created, especially with its neighboring states. So this is an effort really to counter China economically, and that's part of what the U.S. certainly is hoping to achieve through these reforms.
Right now, Gordon, coming to you, how do you feel India and U.S. defense ties are going to evolve from here on?
And Gordon, also, if you can just weigh in on the multilateralism that Jessica just spoke about, because, we can't talk about multilateralism without mentioning the BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative. Do you think there is going to be a counter there? Or do you think something is brewing which does kind of undermine the BRI, which is obviously it's something China is very, very ambitious about. How do you see that happening going forward?
Yeah, the Belt and Road Initiative will undermine itself. Got to remember that what Beijing has been doing is been building infrastructure that the private markets don't feel is bankable. And China is doing this for strategic purposes. And it's many of these projects, as we know, are ending up in trouble. We saw in Sri Lanka, for instance, China, therefore, because of the problems there, took over the Hambantota port. We're also seeing this in other countries as well. The big issue is going to be whether the IMF is going to bail China out of some of these situations. And, I think the appetite for that in the rest of the world is pretty low and getting lower because countries are starting to see China's foreign policies as malign and therefore don't feel that they should be helping China out of its Belt and Road program.
Thanks, Gordon. Siddhant, I want to come back to you. Tell us about the joint communique. Of course, there is a lot of speculation around it. There are a lot of opinions around it. How do you see it going forward? From what we know, the section on Ukraine has been left blank. It's 255 words. It's still taking precedence over all the other paragraphs that are there, but we still need to discuss it. Talk to us about the communique.
Well, when it comes to the joint statement, the Sherpas are burning the midnight oil, I would say, in many senses. And the focus is that how India can form the consensus, become a bridge when it comes to the various warring factions. But essentially, when it comes to will there be a joint statement or not, we'll get to know only tomorrow. But what India can do is to go towards the East Asia Summit way. Now, earlier this week, we saw the East Asia Summit where all these elements, Russia, China, US are present and all have different view regarding the mention of Ukraine. Now, the joint statement that was issued after the East Asia Summit was a statement which had no mention of Ukraine. New Delhi can use the similar model on that issue and come up with a joint statement without the mention of Ukraine. But there are red lines. The West is saying that they are not going to back out when it comes to mention of Ukraine. And they have been saying that this is an issue that impacts the global economy as well. While Russia has said that G20 is a grouping which is a grouping that focuses on the economic issue. It's not a political grouping and it should not discuss Ukraine issues. So largely how India can form the consensus, it's up to India's diplomatic skill, and we will get to know in next 24 hours where and in which direction the joint statement goals.
Now, Jessica, this is again something we were talking about earlier. I knew you had something to ask Gordon regarding this as well, regarding multilateral global trade, the reforms, and how BRI is essentially going to be taking some kind of a hit here. As Gordon already mentioned, that BRI is going to undermine itself. He has his opinions on it. If there's anything you want to take from him, please go ahead.
Actually, I'm really interested in his thoughts on the line that Washington has to walk in terms of trying to draw India into a stronger defense alliance with the United States. Obviously, that's not something India's foreign policy has traditionally done, but there really is an undercurrent in Washington to push New Delhi towards more cooperation in the Indo-Pacific. So what are your thoughts on the line they have to walk diplomatically in Washington?
Certainly, Washington would like to do that. India has, as you point out, traditionally been non-aligned and not entered into defense treaties. And I don't see India entering into any defense treaty with the United States. But this, again, is really going to be driven by what's occurring in China. Right now, there are some really, really disturbing signs of purges in the Chinese military, as well as rumors about the foreign ministry. These rumors point to a Xi Jinping who is much weaker than people thought. We don't know how this is going to drive events in China, but if it does drive it in a more belligerent way, then clearly Washington and the United States and the other two members of the Quad, Australia and Japan, are going to be working very closely together because they're not going to have a choice. If China, if China has so many problems, it just sort of implodes and doesn't do anything out externally, then we're not going to see very much cooperation among members of the Quad.
Right. Let's also bring our principal diplomatic correspondent, Siddhant Sibil, into this conversation. Siddhant, what's your take on this? And of course, do you think India has a difficult balancing act here as well to play?
Well, diplomacy is all about balancing things and how India can do that. India has the experience.
India
was
that,
the leading member of the non-alignment movement.
India shines at diplomacy, no doubt in that. Go ahead, Siddhant. Yeah.
Well, essentially the focus is also when it comes to pointing out to global challenges, and there was a conversation on BRI. India has opposed BRI primarily because it passes through a territory which is an Indian territory, and the opposition will continue. Now, India was one of the first countries to show its opposition towards BRI, and we know that since then the opposition has only grown. In fact, the Italians are the latest to add into the list. And also remember that China is going to host the BRI summit later this year in October. The presence of countries is something that will be keenly noted, and it can be safely said that India will not be in that list. One thing before I leave you is the fact that India has always made sure that there is no mention of BRI when it comes to joint statement, whether it's the BRICS joint statement or the upcoming G20 joint statement. Of course, there's an opposition by the Chinese side over mention of Indian philosophical themes. So India versus China, we have seen in various groupings from UN to G20, and this is something that is the reality of life in many ways.
Siddhant, thank you for obviously all your inputs, but I see a lot of, a nice visual behind you as well. If you could ask your video journalist to pan the camera around and show us around the entire G20 venue where you are standing, of course. Talk to us about where you are.
So I'm just standing in front of the summit location,
right,
where the world leaders will be coming. So I'll ask my camera person Sanjeev to show you the Bharat Mandapam. This is the place on your screen right now where the world leaders will be converging and holding the summit meeting. The meeting, of course, begins later today. In fact, almost in 1 hour's time, we will see the world leaders converging here. Arrival begins in 1 hour's time, and then there is, as you pointed out, there are sessions, One Earth, and of course One Family session today. There will be a session tomorrow as well. The Indian president hosts the summit as well, the dinner as well for the visiting leaders. But all in all, for India, it is a moment to showcase itself, to showcase its soft power. And we have been going through this entire area. There is a culture corridor here, there is a craft bazaar here, there is a pavilion to showcase India's digital payments mechanism, and this is India's way to showcase itself, because remember, not only the leaders are going to come here in this very building, but also many delegates, many foreign media, and everyone gets a piece of India to carry with themselves back home.
Right. All right. Well, Siddhant, Jessica and Mr. Chang, thank you so much for joining us on the show with your insights on this.
Thank you.